I pressed the button. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this morning's Volunteer Tourism Conversations. I'm Dr. Peter Robinson and I'm head of the Centre for Tourism and Hospitality at Leeds Beckett University. This is the third and final conversation on the practical advancements of the field of volunteer tourism, and is the third of the events that have been jointly hosted between the School of Events, Tourism and Hospitality Management at Leeds Beckett and Atlas. So if you have missed the previous conversations, you can find those in the Atlas channel on YouTube. And obviously today's event will also be on that same channel afterwards. And of course, you might be joining and watching live, which I'll come on to in a moment and talk about posting questions. I'll just briefly first introduce today's two participants and pass on an apology from Claudia. So you will have seen in the original invite that Claudia was due to join this event, but unfortunately due to unforeseen circumstances can't be with us today. So the event might be slightly shorter than planned, but not by any means any less exciting. So instead, Elisa and Eliza are going to have the conversation between them. So I'll just introduce Eliza first. And Eliza is an award-winning social entrepreneur at the forefront of advancing community-led sustainable tourism through collaboration and innovation. She is the founder of Good Travel, senior advisor to the Rise Travel Institute, instructor of entrepreneurship, innovation and social change at the University for Peace, established by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and a doctoral tourism researcher at Victoria University of Wellington. Elisa, and obviously we're very aware, Elisa and Eliza, we could easily become confused. Elisa is a senior lecturer in the School of Events, Tourism and Hospitality Management at Leeds Beckett and joint coordinator of the Atlas Volunteer Tourism Special Interest Group with David Stachel. David A also sends his apologies as he can't be with us today. Elisa's research focuses on the intersection between tourism responsibility and ethics, and her research interests include interdisciplinary approaches to volunteer tourism, global development, tourism ethnographies, and development in the global south. So before I hand over to Elisa and Eliza, I'll just remind the audience about the opportunity to post questions. Jane will be keeping an eye on some of those questions, as will I, and I think probably halfway through the discussion and then at the end, we'll pause and provide the audience with an opportunity to have some of those questions answered. So we'll read out those questions if you post them during the conversation. So I hope you very much enjoy the next 45 to 50 minutes and can spend a little bit longer than that if everybody wants to, answering some of those questions. So I will hand over to Elisa and Eliza.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Jane, for looking after the chat and the questions. As Peter said, feel free to ask questions as Eliza and myself are going through this conversation, which I'm looking forward to. And we're going to take a little break in between our conversation just to ask the audience if they have questions, and then we move on to the second half of our chat. So Eliza, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I'm really excited about our chat. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your involvement in volunteer tourism and been engaging with your publications in the field, and we have something in common in terms of field work, because I have done my research mainly in the context of Peru about volunteer tourism. So I'm just curious a little bit about your involvement, how it started, and why, and how you went through this journey in volunteer tourism a while back.
Sure, thank you, Elisa, our shared names. So my first experience was as a volunteer tourist myself, and I was 18 years old volunteering in Guatemala in an orphanage. And I guess it was through that experience that I first began to kind of critically question the whole volunteer tourism sector. My first job in the orphanage was sorting through a container of goods that had been donated from the United States to support the orphanage. And in that container, I found a pair of snow skis, which, as I'm sure you'll be aware, was not much use in the context of a Guatemalan orphanage in the jungle. And kind of in that moment, I had a realization that myself as an 18-year-old who didn't speak Spanish and had no experience working with vulnerable children, I was very much like the snow skis, very well intentioned, but not that much use in that context. And over the years, I've come to realize that actually it was worse than not being much use. I was potentially causing harm in that context. So that was kind of my first personal experience. And then a few years later, after having volunteered in various other organizations and places around the world, I did my master's in volunteer tourism, looking at best practice in volunteer tourism, and was confident that I had figured it out. And I had my framework of best practice, and was feeling very confident as I headed into my first job managing international volunteers in Cusco in Peru for an organization which I think you're also familiar with, Elisa. And that was a real, I guess, reality check, because I was suddenly managing, up to 100 new volunteers each month, and how to do that in a way that would genuinely benefit local communities. So I did that for a couple of years, so on the receiving organization side of things, and then I returned to New Zealand and worked for the Global Volunteer Network, which is a large recruitment and sending organization. And I think, I was with them for a number of years, and a kind of a turning point for me was in 2010. You'll remember the devastating earthquake in Haiti. And after that event, there were hundreds of phone calls to our office of volunteers, particularly from the United States, wanting to go and volunteer in Haiti. And we accepted all of them without having a local partner in Haiti, without having any particular understanding of what was needed. And then part of my job was to then go to Haiti and set up this volunteer program and work with the volunteers. And so realizing the extent to which volunteer tourism and our own organization had become demand driven and not driven by local needs and local requests. And so that was really quite a turning point for me. But I'll stop there and feel free to ask more questions.
Really interesting. And in terms of different settings, and because what happened in Haiti was very different, I guess, from what you were doing in the context of South America, Guatemala and Cusco, in terms of perhaps the commercial side of the industry. Was this kind of an important aspect for you, this kind of difference? I mean, looking at the Haitian context, you would think there is a need there because obviously there's a natural emergency that happened. So did you feel different in terms of, or did you look at the industry differently then, moving from the South American context to the Haitian one?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways it was similar issues in terms of, volunteers who were being sold an experience of coming to save the world and not being sufficiently trained or qualified for the type of work that they were doing, and large numbers of volunteers. So I think it was similar issues, but I think in Haiti it was really amplified because it was a humanitarian crisis situation, and so it was really needing people who had experience working in that kind of environment, and our volunteers did not. So it was, even though we had some medical volunteers, for example, but they had never worked in that kind of context before. And so there were all kinds of challenges, and really we shouldn't have been there. You know, it was work for organizations like the Red Cross, like Médecins Sans Frontières, organizations that this was what they did. And so it was really you know, I guess over the years, I'd increasingly had concerns with volunteer tourism, but that was kind of the point when I was like realizing that the whole model of being driven by what volunteers wanted and what they believed they could contribute was flawed.
Very interesting. And because of this realization of the challenges and, you know, this understanding that you developed over the course of the years, being yourself a volunteer or managing volunteers as well, as a kind of have you moved away from the industry or the field because of this realization, or do you still feel you part of the volunteer tourism field? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one I was thinking about quite a bit before this presentation, actually. And even when you asked me to be part of it, I was like, am I still part of volunteer tourism or not? So I guess I do still recognize the benefits that volunteer tourism can bring. I mean, certainly in terms of volunteers, and I think that's been very well documented within the academic literature in terms of the potential for personal growth and transformation even, but also for host organizations. I mean, the funding that volunteers can bring, it can be very useful, but also, you know, new energy, new ideas and that kind of thing. But I think, you know, since I first became involved in volunteer tourism, it's become increasingly a competitive industry, right? So when Global Volunteer Network started, for example, there were not that many similar kinds of organizations doing what we're doing. And so as it became a more competitive industry, the financial pressures began to kind of override some of the more philanthropic intentions of the organizations and why they've been started in the first place. And then related to that, I think the volunteer tourism experiences that were being sold became more and more commodified. And so they became more and more about selling what volunteers were looking for in terms of wanting to have a positive impact and wanting to feel needed. And then related to that, the power inequality that again has been documented in the literature became even stronger, I think. You know, when it's just a few volunteers coming through and having direct contact with organizations before they come, that's very different to kind of large scale sale of volunteer tourism packages where volunteers have no contact with host organizations before they come in as the expert and with very unrealistic expectations. And so with that power imbalance between kind of the volunteer expert and the local needy, I think that creates a whole host of problems. And that's really kind of where I got to with a lot of my concerns, and feeling that we really needed to move beyond that and have an alternative where I guess we could reconnect with some of the initial intentions of volunteer tourism, which was to have that opportunity for deeper and more meaningful cultural exchange and for creating solidarity, you know, between people of different cultures, and also enabling volunteers to be more critical in how they approached their experience and how they reflected on the work that they were doing. And so through that is where kind of good travel emerged from. So it did emerge as an alternative to volunteer tourism and as, I guess, an opportunity to address some of the problems of volunteer tourism whilst ideally still advancing some of the benefits of volunteer tourism. And good travel is my social enterprise that I co-founded with 3 other women. So we're 4 women from 4 continents. and yeah, about to celebrate our 10-year anniversary.
Oh, fab. Yeah, I've been looking at the website, and it's fascinating. And I was really interested in reading the stories of you all, and the experiences that you tell in the website. I'm really interested in. I mean, you gave me some hope as you were speaking in terms of kind of creating an alternative, because I agree with you in when you flagged many of the kind of challenges and issues that the industry of volunteer tourism has kind of developed, and maybe intentionally and unintentionally, I think, in some context. But this sense of alternative innovation, and especially very close to my heart, this sense of creating solidarity, how does it take shape in good travel? What do you do in more kind of practical terms? So that kind of links back to also today's conversation on the practical advancements. It'd be brilliant to know what you ladies do in terms of alternative.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the key pieces was trying to address the power imbalance that we were, and the power dynamic that we were concerned with within volunteer tourism. So being very clear that we are traveling to learn, to confront our own assumptions, and not to serve. So we are clear that we are visitors to a place, not volunteers or experts. So we're there to learn, to connect, to share, but not to teach or advise others. Having said that, we do still sometimes participate in volunteer projects. So this is what some of the thinking I was having when you were initially emailing me. And I think the key difference is that we're not a volunteer tourism organization. So it's to do with our local partners. So we always include a donation to a local project as part of all of our group trips. And then if the local project requests for us to volunteer, then we will do so. But that's not a core part of what we're trying to do. And so an example, I think, can be helpful. So in Fiji, for example, the donation went to the local village for them to use on a local project, however they wished. And then they said, look, can you come and spend the day with us? We'd love for you to have the opportunity to get to know our village, to get to know us. And come on Sunday, because we won't be working. You can help us. You can volunteer and help us clean the church. So we're not a religious organization in any way, but this was requested by the local village, and it was the perfect opportunity to be alongside local people in an environment that was important to them, where we were all kind of chipping in together and spending time together. And then afterwards, when the cleaning was completed, we all sat down and had afternoon tea together in the village. And so it wasn't about serving in the same sense that volunteer tourism would be. It was about sharing that experience and connecting and being responsive to what they wanted us to do as well. And then I guess the other piece is related to, at Good Travel, we're very aware that we are visitors, and that a key part of being a visitor is the money that we spend. And so we're conscious consumers in that sense. So all of the accommodations that we partner with, all of the restaurants that we eat at, all of the tours that we participate in are through local partners that share the same values as us. Many of them are also social enterprises or nonprofit organizations. And that's really a key component to our trips, is ensuring that every dollar that we spend is having a positive effect within the community through local partners. And then I think the last piece is by, I guess, approaching travel as really an opportunity to learn and to connect. It's also then giving us the chance to reflect on our own lives back home. And I think that's where maybe travel has the most potential to affect positive change is not in that week that you're overseas, but it's what happens when you come home. And so we have a strong focus around encouraging our travelers to think about what they can do when they come home to perhaps help the country that they visited through fundraising for the local project that we spent time at, or online volunteering maybe even, or that kind of thing, but also in terms of your day-to-day life. So in Iceland or New Zealand, for example, we visit the glaciers and talk a lot about climate change. And so then, how can, when you return home, offset, of course, your travels, but on a day-to-day level, how can you also think a little bit differently and act differently in a way that will have positive impacts. So yeah, a bit of an overview there.
Fascinating. So it made me think that kind of the volunteering or volunteer tourism, the way we use the terminology is quite different in the context of good travel, and is kind of even a smaller part of the whole experience. So it's really interesting. Because you come from this very interesting background, is so you've got the practical experience of being a volunteer, and now that you are the co-founder of this social enterprise, Good Travel, and you're also an academic. I think you are the perfect person and very knowledgeable person to tell us perhaps a little bit, if you can, how these two words of academia and the industry can be, if you think they communicate, obviously in relation to volunteer tourism. So we flagged, you flagged at the beginning some of the main challenges. For example, this desire of wanting to save the world is something I wanted to do when I was volunteering, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna make a big difference, and you go into the field very naively and think that things can be changed because perhaps you don't have the knowledge. In fact, most of the times there's this lack of knowledge of the context and the needs, and
Exactly.
and very little reflection on the privileged background where we come from. So this kind of mobility between the global north and global south in the context of volunteer tourism, which is key, I think, in many respects. And also this focus on, you mentioned this, Eliza, the care for the self rather than for others. So the need to improve the CV, tick a box, or really, feeling the need of having to help because our societies are kind of imposing that on us as you are responsible to do good because we don't have money or time to do it as state government. So this is on you individual, and all of a sudden development becomes doable, becomes fun, becomes commercialized and part of the commodities that we can purchase and also throw away in a way, part of these consumist societies that we're part of. And this is just to mention a few, but in one of your early publications in 2008, you talk about the misunderstanding and reinforcement, or cultural misunderstanding and reinforcement of stereotypes via volunteer tourism operations and actions. And so these are a few of the challenges and issues that the literature has flagged, you have mentioned and written about. And so how do you think the industry is receptive to this sort of red warnings, and also and if yes, how do you think he's kind of reacting, and if he's reacting to these warnings, and in general, what is the impact of academia that within the field of volunteer tourism for the industry, and how these two words can be put into communication if there is this lack of, or there is a gap?
Yeah, I think it's a big question, and I think it's an important question for tourism in general, right? Because I think there's so much great research happening in academia which isn't reaching industry. And I think, I mean, for Good Travel, we have our trips as one aspect of what we do, but we also have the education and advocacy side of what we do. And one of our goals there is to help be a bridge between academia and the real world. So we have our podcast and our blog, for example, which is often involving sharing the latest research or interviewing researchers and practitioners about these kinds of issues in a way that speaks to people working within industry, but also visitors themselves. So that, and I think in volunteer tourism in particular, some of what has been researched in academia has reached the media, which I think has been overall a positive thing, because I think there is more awareness amongst the average person that, you know, volunteer tourism is something you need to research a little bit and is not automatically a good thing. Certainly there's still a lot of people that might not have that awareness now, but I think it has had some impact. And I think orphanage volunteering is a great example. And the research that was done in showing, you know, the harm being caused by orphanage volunteers in creating demand essentially for orphanages. And then the work that has been done by Rethink Orphanages and some of these other advocacy organizations, Better Care Network, to make sure people are aware of that. And within the volunteer tourism sector as well, having sending organizations signing up to committing to slowly stopping to work with orphanages and that kind of thing. So I think there are positive changes that are coming from research that's happening. But at the same time, there's the reality of working in volunteer tourism organizations. And I myself experienced that, right? Like I did my master's, I had my framework of best practice, I knew exactly what needed to be done. And then suddenly I have 100 volunteers arriving tomorrow and my beautiful matching framework of skills and experience to local projects is thrown out the window, and I'm just trying to get people into a project, you know, and it's just hard when it's happening on that scale, I guess. And I think that's where the whole commodification of the volunteer tourism industry is challenging. And so there's also the issue with the increasing competitiveness of it that then has driven down the pricing. That was a conversation we often had at Global Volunteer Network, is how much can we charge for a volunteer placement? Because suddenly other organizations were charging half of what we were. So then should we force our prices down? But then of course, then you have to get more volunteers so you can pay your staff. I mean, it's difficult then to be true to your mission and to your values that you started off with. And so I think even in those situations when you know what best practice should be, you're often just kind of in survival mode and trying to do things that, you know, get you through to the end of the month. And so, yeah, I guess so there's a couple of pieces there, right? There's the communication, making sure that this research is getting to industry, is getting to visitors. And certainly there's a lot more that can be done there. And then there's secondly, the practical realities that even if we know this, are we acting on it accordingly?
Really interesting. And for me, this is a constant struggle in terms of the sort of having healthy communications between the two worlds, the academic and the industry worlds, also in relation to some of the challenges that we experience at the broader societal level, such as, for example, climate change, and to which ASIL, you know, links to the volunteering or volunteer tourism field as well. And I might ask you a question later on in terms of the kind of the future of the industry. But yeah, I agree in terms of communication and trying to, you know, embed some of the messages that come out from research as well, and perhaps working in partnership and creating these sort of linkages that can help the industry also to kind of shape better practices. So I think this might be a good time to just have a little break in terms of asking the audience if there's any question, because I feel I've been speaking a lot, and so maybe some of our attendees on YouTube are posing questions. Jane.
Thanks, Elisa. And we don't have any questions on YouTube at the moment. However, I was wondering if I could ask a question, please, Elisa. I was interested in what you were saying about taking travel as an approach to kind of an opportunity to learn and connect with people and make changes in their life afterwards when they return home. I wondered if you followed up with travellers afterwards and what kind of changes they have made.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we think is really important to do, to see kind of down the track what changes have happened. Certainly, you know, post-trip, we have an evaluation where we ask what impact the trip has had on them and ask for examples and that kind of thing. But then I think, a year down the track, it would be really interesting to follow up and see to what extent those changes have been implemented and sustained. One of the things we're really careful to educate travellers on, and this was actually the same when I was working in volunteer tourism, I was really, in briefings and things, I was really careful to ensure that people don't over-promise. Mm-hmm. Often when you're in a situation, whether it's visiting a project or volunteering at a project, you're highly motivated to support them. And so often volunteers and tourists return home and then slot back into regular life and don't follow through on those commitments. And that's the worst thing, really, you know, for a local organization. And they see it again and again. And after a while, they get pretty disillusioned with it. So I think there is a risk, you know, that people commit to making changes or to fundraising and supporting and then go home and don't follow through. And I think as Good Travel or other organizations, there's things we can do to help maintain that commitment and remind people of those commitments as well. And I do feel like that's where, in some ways, travel can be justified. I think there's a lot of discussion at the moment of whether we should be traveling at all, right? And so if we're only having a positive impact during that 1 week of travel, and that positive impact is being compared to the negative impact in terms of climate change and carbon emissions and whatever else, is it justifiable? But if we're looking longer term and you are having some kind of experience which is making you question how you live at home and change behaviors long term, then I think there's suddenly then maybe a way to keep justifying the purpose of travel and the potential for travel to create long-term behavior change.
I totally agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so like Jane, I have no questions in the chat, but I also have a question. My question is for Elisa rather than Eliza. Right. So obviously you've had the opportunity to ask Eliza lots of questions about her experiences. I'd be interested in knowing a little bit about how her experiences and yours are similar or different.
Thanks, Peter. We briefly had the opportunity to chat with Eliza about some of the similarities, I think, of our experiences in the field. I'm coming more from an academic perspective, because when I did become a volunteer tourist, it was part of my academic journey as well. So I was doing research in volunteer tourism as well. So I've experienced the practical challenges of being a volunteer and the frustration at times, because I was often paired with, so the context was Cusco, Peru. So Eliza is familiar with that. I know many commercial companies that were involved in the sector. I worked with them. And so in terms of the challenges, it was having to work, for example, with volunteer tourists that couldn't speak the language. And I was there, I could speak Spanish, so I was constantly frustrated because I had to translate for the volunteers and also look after little children, because I worked in an after-school project and in a shelter house for teenager mothers. And so there was the frustration of looking after the children. I didn't have children at the time, so it was particularly challenging for me. And it was a bunch of children, 10, 15, of various ages, up to 5 in one project, up to 11 in another one. So all the challenges that brings, and also looking after the volunteers really, because they didn't know much about what they were doing. They couldn't follow instructions because they didn't understand the language. So it was a challenging experience, really interesting though from an academic perspective, but also practical perspective. In my role as a both volunteer tourist and academic, it was challenging also to be trusted by members of staff or people that were running social projects or the social projects where I worked, because there was the worry of ruining, for example, their reputation and their image. And this was kind of another question I wanted to ask to Eliza in terms of it kind of breaking this cycle of dependency. So many are financially dependent on the flows of volunteers or volunteer tourists. And so obviously, understandably, they were scared about what my presence could have done to their projects, and so the dependency element. I think Eliza, you might have experienced that as well, and I could see members of local communities being a little bit defensive about what they were doing and not so open to the dialogue on what can we do better or how can we work together to perhaps make some changes, particularly when we look at tourism as an ever-evolving industry and very dynamic industry as well. So I think volunteer tourism back in 2010 is probably quite different to volunteer tourism 0.2, what we are experiencing now, and certainly in a post-pandemic world. So I think there are several points because of the context, and I often think the context is important, because what happens in Cusco or in the context of Peru might be quite different to Thailand or Cambodia, in terms of the setting and the needs, obviously, and even the ways of doing volunteer tourism.
And even then comparing that to, say, New Zealand, where we are with good travel, for example, we're much more likely to jump into an opportunity to volunteer here, because perhaps there's less kind of issues around the power imbalance, right? And so and particularly with, say, a conservation project or something like that, it's quite different. And it's often saying, well, what would you do in your own country? Like, would you go and volunteer in a school in your own country, or just march into school for a day and offer to help out, And so that would never be offered in New Zealand, and so it shouldn't be offered in other countries either. But yeah, I totally agree with you on the context that it's very different in each individual country and in each different place, in each host organization, and being really aware of that is really important.
Yeah, really good, because you were saying about, obviously you brought back the attention to New Zealand, and I often forget, because my experience is located mainly in the Global South, but you're absolutely right. There are so many ways of doing volunteer tourism. They are out there. They involve movement between the Global North and the Global North, or Global South and Global South. So not necessarily the mobility I'm more familiar with, but certainly there are different ways and different contexts also in terms of more focused on conservation, for example, that doesn't involve people in some cases.
Yeah, and I think Claudia Eckhart, was it, the woman who was supposed to be speaking today? I read her paper, and I thought it was really helpful in terms of understanding the diversity and complexity of volunteer tourism experiences, right? I think what we've been talking about today has been mostly this idea of commodified volunteers from global north going to the global south, doing their kind of 1 to 4 week childcare placement, but there's so much more diversity within the sector than just that. And I know one of the things I've kind of struggled with is, I guess, almost a temptation to just advocate for not doing volunteer tourism whatsoever, because that's kind of easier for people to understand. But actually, you know, volunteering in another country in itself can be a really positive thing, but it's the way that it's sort of developed as an industry that has brought so many concerns, particularly that model of global north to global south. So I think recognizing that complexity and that diversity and being open to, I guess, critically looking at different ways of doing it is really important, particularly as we look forward, right, in terms of where to from here. Yeah,
totally. I often struggle when I think about volunteer tourism. I struggle to, like you, I thought many times, let's not do volunteer tourism anymore, it's all bad. But then, you know, putting things into perspective, you think actually there are lots of good examples in different contexts, and as you said, taking into consideration different modalities of doing them. But I often struggle with this concept of where does tourism start or end, in terms of if you do volunteering in the region or city or context that you're most familiar with because you've come from there, is that still tourism, or where is that tourism element, and how is it the two dimensions of traveling, learning, exchanging, and the helping part, or giving your time for a cause? You know, how do they meet, and which are the dynamics that then form or give shape to these sub fields of the tourism industry, I guess. So
that's great. I'll allow you both to carry on the conversation.
Thank you so much for your questions, though. It's just, I think this final part of our conversation has kind of taken us to, as you mentioned, Eliza, to the future and what next, really. So what we experienced in the past couple of years has been unprecedented and really challenging globally, global north, global south, everywhere, because of the pandemic. So I was curious to know what your thoughts were in regards to the work you're doing with your social enterprise, so Good Travel. So how has the pandemic impacted the way you think and do volunteering as part of your travels, even if in minimal parts? And how do you think volunteer tourism is shaping in a post-pandemic world, or when we get to a post-pandemic world?
I'll start with the first part. So Good Travel, for sure, it's been an interesting few years, and I think a chance to really reflect on what we have been doing for the past 10 years and what we want to be doing for the next 10 years. And I think a big piece of that for us has been really shifting our focus towards more of the education and advocacy side of things. So we are continuing to do trips, but more as a way to put research into practice and to create models and examples of how travel can look, but not become kind of a large-scale commodified organization, which was an option for us, right, pre-pandemic. Like, we could really scale all of our trips and be doing them all of the time, but really feeling like to have the kind of impact we wanted, focusing more on the education piece, can reach more people. particularly because many of the people who are joining our trips are already people who are thinking about these kinds of issues and are already kind of on board with a lot of what we're advocating for. And I guess in relation to volunteer tourism specifically, we work closely with RISE Travel Institute, which is a nonprofit organization in the United States. They're quite new. They've only been around a couple of years, but they're doing fantastic work in terms of educating travelers about how to be good travelers, essentially. And I worked with them on, they have a program with a number of modules, and one of them is specifically on volunteer tourism and ways in which to move kind of beyond that model of volunteer tourism, which has become dominant within the sector. So I think thinking of good travel, but then also, how do we link that into wider education efforts? And I think we're increasingly talking about regenerative tourism, right? And my colleagues are much more expert in that than me, but essentially the way that I understand it is starting with a place and thinking about what a place needs, and then framing tourism's purpose around that, rather than the other way around, right? And so thinking about, well, if a place, a destination is struggling with, say, youth unemployment, how can tourism be brought in to help with that particular issue? And it could be that volunteer tourism is then a part of that, or it could be that it's not, but starting with the problem rather than starting with the solution of volunteer tourism. And so I think that's kind of where we've got to with good travel, but also where kind of I see the potential for volunteer tourism moving forward. So I guess that links into the second part of your question in terms of where to from here. And I mean, I do think the past few years have resulted in greater awareness of the privilege of travel, of the luxury of travel, and of the responsibility that comes with that. And related somewhat to that, I think, is this greater demand for more meaningful travel experiences and real opportunities for connection. And so where does volunteer tourism then kind of fit within all of that? And I tend to think, and this might be biased because of good travel and who we are, but I do think social enterprise has a real place to play, and small scale educational travel and small scale volunteer tourism perhaps within that, but which is really locally led and locally driven rather than these large scale volunteer tourism organizations, has a potential to be part of this shift and this rethink of tourism towards a more regenerative mindset and paradigm, but then leaving the real international development work to organizations that know how to do that, right? And to local organizations that know how to do that. So it's not to say that volunteering overseas is always a bad thing. Like we've said, it can be positive, particularly when we look at some of the organizations like Volunteer Service Abroad in New Zealand, VSO, I think in the UK, that are really working in international development, but using volunteers to support those objectives. So again, starting with local places, with identifying problems, and then thinking about how volunteers can be recruited and trained to support that. So yeah, perhaps kind of leaving that to the experts, and then working as smaller social enterprises, as smaller locally led organizations to think about how tourism can still have a purpose as we move forward.
Fantastic. Yeah, really interesting. I'd like, if I've got a bit of time, just the final question, and then we ask the audience again if there's any question. But I'm really interested in the first part of what you were saying in terms of advocacy and education. So the education part, I think that's really important. There's some literature that has highlighted the potential benefits of the industry or this as seeing volunteer tourism as a way of fostering the creation of social movements and a way of creating awareness and engage and youngsters to fight for better societies and a better world. Also, when they are, looking at that kind of transformative element of potential of volunteer tourism. So what I'm interested in knowing from your perspective is, do you think that there is the potential of volunteer tourism or people that engage with volunteer tourism? First of all, how do we get to, you said, we have in Good Travel people, they share our same way of doing things or our mindset, or perhaps they've got some concerns in terms of climate change and poverty and sorts of social inequalities and so on. How can we use, and if we can use volunteer tourism to reach out to those that are not perhaps so involved in societal and environmental issues, and is there a potential for the industry to then start to make these changes and create some sort of socio-ecological awareness among future tourists, perhaps, or future volunteer tourists, or people that are a part of the industry? There is not just those that share our way of looking at things, or the moral side, perhaps, I guess, of volunteering, but they are more perhaps a little bit more into the tourism or travel side of fun and just wanted to travel. So how do you think there is the potential, and how from a practical perspective?
Thank you. Some really interesting points there. Yeah, I want to start just on the first bit you were talking about in terms of social movements and whether volunteer tourism can foster that kind of shift in mindset. It's kind of linked to my PhD research too, which is looking at global citizenship and the potential for travel to foster global citizenship. And I think, there's quite a bit of literature on this within volunteer tourism specifically, but I think the risk with kind of the existing commodified model of volunteer tourism is that it fosters what we might call soft global citizenship or thin global citizenship, which is this idea that as individuals we can save the world as people from another country coming in, and we just need to donate and that's going to sort everything out, versus critical global citizenship, which is where we want to really be, which is questioning kind of the whole power structures that have and historical challenges that have caused the inequality in the first place. And that's where the idea of social movements and really questioning all of that has occurred come in. But for volunteer tourism to do that, it would need to change significantly, I think, because certainly the volunteer tourism programs that I was involved in, we were not having that kind of depth of conversation with our volunteers. At best, we were asking them to go home and fundraise, which would be under the soft global citizenship, but we weren't talking about, why is there poverty in this country in the first place? What's going on there? So I think that's where the educational piece is so important. And so if there is volunteer tourism moving forward, how does that become better coupled with real critical education and reflection to prompt some of those changes in understandings and hopefully then action as well. So that was the first piece. And then your second question was kind of how do we reach beyond the niche of people who are already thinking how we think? And I think that's a really important question. And as we are seeing tourism come back post-pandemic, I think there's real concerns with it, you know, just going back to business as usual. And there's been so much talk over the past few years, you know, of rethinking, resetting, you know. And my parents were in Venice a couple of weeks ago and talking to them about their experience and realizing, you know, has anything actually really changed now that things are bouncing back? And so I think it's critical that we are finding ways to not only talk to industry, but talk to visitors, and how do we do that? And I've done a bit of research into visitor pledges, which you might be familiar with, like the Palau Pledge. In New Zealand, we have the Tiaki Promise, and the Icelandic Pledge, the Sustainable Finland Pledge, and opportunities like that, which can reach, I guess, your more average traveller, and get them thinking about some of these issues. And I think that's where destinations and destination management organisations really need to play a role in terms of saying, okay, this is acceptable behaviour and this is not. And actually, if you're not willing to sign our pledge, in the case of Palau, for example, you're not allowed into our country. And if you sign our pledge and you don't do what you say you're going to do, you will be fined. And so really empowering destinations to stand up for themselves and to say, look, if tourism is not improving the lives of the people in our communities and is causing harm, then let's do something different, you know. So I think pledges are one opportunity there. Also, I mentioned Rise Travel Institute. Another thing we're doing there is destination courses. So we know that, you know, the average traveller isn't going to do our full program with multiple modules and that kind of thing, but travellers may be willing to sign up for an hour's course about how to be a good traveller in New Zealand. So courses are going to be offered for destinations worldwide that are run by local people, where possible Indigenous people, to say, look, you're coming to my country, this is what you should and shouldn't be doing while you're here. So different ways, I guess, of communicating in fun, positive ways often, but also an opportunity to reach kind of beyond people who are already thinking like us.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. I've learned a lot from what you were saying, and I'll definitely use some of this information also for my classes. I would like to ask Jane and Peter again if there are questions from the audience just before we
don't have any moment in YouTube. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can finish the conversation here, if that's okay for today. But yeah, I hope there will be more coming, and obviously being part of the special interest group of Atlas on volunteer tourism, we invite the audience on YouTube, if they haven't joined the special interest group yet, to join it, and to keep these sort of conversations going, particularly looking at the developments and the dynamism of the industry. So I think it's healthy to have these conversations on the industry. Thank you so much, Eliza, for being with us today and for sharing your expertise with us. As I said, I've learned a lot myself, and I'll definitely go back to the recording and so that I can rewatch what we talked about and think more about how the industry is taking shape now and what needs doing. Thank you so much, Peter and Jane, for helping us moderating and facilitating today's conversation. Thanks so much to Leontine for your help with Atlas, and Davide, who has helped to organize and develop these conversations. And also, of course, to Claudia, that unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but hopefully we will have other opportunities to engage with her. So thank you so much once again, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.